Frogs are the mightiest and meanest and most vicious animal ever mentioned in recorded history. I mean, they're just bad to the bone. In fact, they are so feared by so many different people that, it's just unbelievable how scary these frogs can be. Frogs. Now that I said that out loud and you guys have watched that, you're probably thinking the coronavirus has finally gotten to the pastor. Yeah, he's lost it. Because really, frogs really aren't that scary. I mean, let's just face it. Frogs are kind of cute. They're rubber stamps and art and a whole bunch of stuff all centered around frogs. We have stories about frogs. Frogs are kind of a central point in our life. They serve a useful purpose. They catch bugs. People like frogs, generally. In the movies, little boys catch them and go run and show their mom. Frogs are, I suppose if worst comes to worst, we can always eat them, right? I mean, then fried frog legs. I've heard of that. I've never really heard of anybody fearing frogs, with the exception of maybe a very few and small minority people. Frogs really aren't. They're just not really that big. They're not really that bad. They're not really anything we're afraid of. In fact, if you were to come up to me and tell me that you're going to curse my household with frogs, I'm going to look at you and say, yeah, go ahead. Whatever. Right? I mean, that's the reality that we have. That's the way we look at things. Frogs just aren't that scary. And what we find is that insignificant as they are, this morning as we look at this Bible passage, we will find that God actually uses frogs to demonstrate his divine sovereignty, his power, and his authority over all of creation, including in the land of Egypt. And he does so in a very unique way. He does so in a unique situation. I think oftentimes in our lives, we all have unique situations that we really don't know what to do. It's hard to describe them to someone who has never been through these situations. The first time, for example, that I was in an auto accident, it was like trying to describe the feeling and the emotions and the situation to someone who'd never been in an auto accident. That was difficult for me to comprehend and difficult for me to even begin to describe everything that had happened. It's the same way, oftentimes when we get caught in situations, sometimes there's just no way we can explain it except to someone who's been down the road. Unique situations. We all have them. And sometimes God's using those unique situations for his demonstrations. Sometimes our unique situations are just a chance for God's demonstrations. This morning we will see God demonstrating his sovereignty in unique ways, in unique situations. You can turn with me in the Bibles to Exodus chapter 8, and we'll read the first 15 verses. You remember last week as we talked, we found the first plague in Egypt, and that one dealt with the Nile River being turned into blood, and how long that was and what that symbolized, the Nile River being the source of life for the Egyptians, and suddenly their way of life and everything that they'd gone through had just suddenly gone up in smoke, literally. There's blood everywhere instead of water. And at the end of chapter 7, it says 7 days passed after the Lord struck the Nile. And then the Lord tells Moses, and we pick that up in chapter 8, verse 1. We'll read the first 15 verses, then we'll point a few things out. It reads, Then the Lord said to Moses, Go into Pharaoh and tell him, this is what Yahweh says, Let my people go, so they may worship me. But if you refuse to let them go, then I will plague all your territory with frogs. The Nile will swarm with frogs. They will come up and go to your palace, into your bedroom, and on your bed, into the houses of your officials and your people, into your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs will come upon you, your people, and all your officials. The Lord then said to Moses, Tell Aaron to stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, the canals, and the ponds, and cause the frogs to come up into the land of Egypt. When Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same thing by their occult practices and brought frogs up into the land of Egypt. Pharaoh then summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Ask Yahweh to remove the frogs from me and my people. Then I will let the people go, and they can sacrifice to Yahweh." Moses said to Pharaoh, "You make the choice rather than me. When should I ask on behalf of you, your officials, and your people, that the frogs be taken away from you and your houses and remain only in the Nile?" "Tomorrow," Pharaoh answered. Moses replied, "As you have said, so that you may know there is no one like Yahweh our God. The frogs will go away from you, your houses, your officials, and your people. The frogs will remain only in the Nile." After Moses and Aaron went from Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord for help concerning the frogs that he had brought against Pharaoh. The Lord did as Moses had said. The frogs in the houses and the courtyards and the fields died. They piled them up in countless heaps, and there was a terrible odor in all the land. But when Pharaoh saw there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So as we look at this unique situation, it's a very unique situation. I mean, come on. Having frogs cover your entire land, that is a very unique situation for this time period. I mean, it probably never happened before. And quite frankly, I don't think it's happened since. We actually read a couple of places in here where it says that, frogs covered the entire land of Egypt. That's a lot of frogs. I mean, just to figure out, how big a frog is, and then try to figure out how many fit in a square mile, and then try to figure out how many square miles are, in Egypt. That's a lot of math. And the fundamental reality is they're countless. They're millions upon billions of frogs in the land of Egypt during this time. This is what happened. A plague of frogs. Literally the most annoying things around. Now, you got to stop and think about this, okay? Frogs are, whatever, but they croak, right? They make noise. So you're in bed at night and you've chased all the frogs out of your bed and you climb in. And next you know, you start feeling them hop on bed. And the same time you feel them hopping on bed, you start hearing them croak, like ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. Can you imagine that? Just the noise alone of millions upon billions of frogs. And they're talking. Ribbit, ribbit. Millions of it, multiplied by billions. All throughout the land. Just the noise alone would drive you nuts. Then you start realizing they're hopping everywhere, and they're moving everywhere, and they're in everything and everything you can. You can't escape these things. If you were a fly, you wouldn't want to be in the land of Egypt during this time, would you? No. This is the unique situation. A very unique situation here. And God really, really demonstrates, I think, the first point made is his power and his sovereignty through humble means. We look at the frog and we just realize there really isn't anything here that is scary. It's not big. It's not nasty. It's not humongous. It's not if you will, it's not something that anybody really is afraid of. I mean, no one in any ancient literature is afraid of a frog. They're just not. Why not? Well, who's afraid of a frog? I mean, that's just fundamental reality. Who's afraid of a frog? Nobody. Frogs are cute. Frogs are, whatever, right? Yet God used frogs for one point and one purpose here, to demonstrate his power and his sovereignty through humble means. It's interesting as we build up to this plague that we find a couple of things. And the first thing that I think kind of want to point out is the fact that God gave Pharaoh a choice. The first thing, he says, "Let my people go, or I will plague you with frogs." So, Pharaoh had a choice. He could have let the people go. These frogs never would have appeared. There's a choice. And I think that's something that we can understand today. In every situation that we're faced with, in everything that we deal with, God always gives us a choice. Maybe you've heard that phrase, the devil made me do it. Or the voices in my head made me do it. I really have a problem with that. Simply because the Almighty gives us the decisions to be made. In everything that we do, there's a decision to be made. And yeah, sometimes we go ahead and put it out in the backwater in our brain and go on autopilot. But the fundamental reality is we're all making decisions every day. Don't believe me? Get out of bed tomorrow and decide, whether to hit the alarm clock to turn it off or hit the snooze button. Getting out of bed tomorrow, you decide what clothes you're going to wear. All of those are decisions. I mean, there's not necessarily right or wrong in either one, but it illustrates the point. We always have a decision to be made. There's always a choice. God always gives us a choice. And that choice, in many cases, is clear-cut, the right choice versus the wrong choice. And the wrong choice is always going to have consequences. In this place, God even told Pharaoh what the choice would be. The good choice to let the people go, or the bad choice, you don't, and I'm going to plague you with frogs. So we see that there is a choice. And Pharaoh obviously made the wrong one, because we find out very next that God then plagues the entirety of the land. Some people will say that, God is the God of the poor, or God is the God of the rich, or some kind of God of the mountains, or God of the sea, or I don't know. They tend to think God as being something else. I had a professor in seminary who told me that God was found among the poor. Yeah, he is. I'll agree with you there. But I'll disagree when you put an exclusive point on that. Here we find what God actually says to Pharaoh when he says, you and your household, first of all, the royalty, and then all of your officials, that's kind of the upper echelon, and then all your people, that's everybody else. God is everywhere. God has sovereignty over everyone. There is no one person or no one thing that does not sit under God's control. That's what we can take out of that. So when God says he's going to plague the land, he's literally plaguing every last person, from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows, to the Pharaoh himself, to the foot washer at somebody's house. What God is saying is, I am God overall. And it's very interesting just to see that, his power and his sovereignty during this time as he goes about proving it or showing it in the most unique ways. This is a unique situation for Pharaoh, certainly. He's never been confronted with this before. And secondarily, this is a unique situation for all of Egypt, as they suddenly have to deal with not only the Nile recently, but now 7 days later, they're dealing with frogs. One whole week passed, now they got frogs everywhere. Millions and billions of these things, just every which direction. Unique situation. So what does that do? Well, this unique situation apparently causes Pharaoh to acknowledge God. It's very fascinating. Verse 8, we read that Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, ask Yahweh to remove the frogs from me and my people. Then I will let the people go and they can sacrifice to Yahweh. This is actually the first time Pharaoh acknowledges God. Very interesting. First time. Prayer. That's pretty much what Pharaoh's asking Moses to do. Go ahead and inquire, pray to God to remove this. And there's a unique thing here that we can see, is that God demonstrates his power and his sovereignty in this unique way through prayer as well. In this particular unique situation, with the frogs everywhere, it's on intercessory behalf of Moses that God actually deals with the problem. Very fascinating. In many cases, God's power and sovereignty is not displayed through prayer. But in this case, we see that. We can see that sometimes this happens. But first, we want to kind of back up and talk a little bit about what prayer is and how that fits into this situation. Oftentimes, people tend to think prayer is some kind of religious or theological entity. I'm sure that you can go quite deep into form and format and the right and the wrong things to do, and I'm sure it can get really complex. But it seems to me that prayer is just talking to the Almighty. It's expressing what's on your heart, or expressing what's in your mind, and expressing what you're dealing with to God. That's what prayer is. It's communication. Now, That being said, just because you say something or ask for something or do something doesn't necessarily mean God's going to respond the way you want him to. I'll just say that. God's not a vending machine. You don't put your prayer in, hit a button, and out pops the stuff you want. It doesn't work that way. Yeah, I've heard a lot of like that. I've heard stories where kids have come up and said, I asked for a pony, and God didn't give it to me. Therefore, there must not be any God. Now, I've heard adults say something similar, but usually they don't ask for ponies. Prayer is not, again, it is not about getting stuff in return. Prayer is about communication with the Almighty. That's what it should be. That's what basic form is. Communication with the Almighty. And when you pray to the Almighty, you're doing two things. The first one is you're acknowledging that there is a God. Simple put, when you've hit rock bottom and you got no place else to turn and to look to, you turn to God and you pray. That's what prayer is. It's acknowledging that God exists. The second thing, it's acknowledging that you believe God can do something about your situation. Pharaoh here, for the first time, is acknowledging that God, not only does he exist, but that he can do something with this unique situation that he's finding himself in. It's interesting. But then we're going to back that up a little further and say, just because Pharaoh believes in God, and just because Pharaoh's asking God to deal with the situation, doesn't necessarily mean Pharaoh's had a change of heart. Sometimes we find prayer leads to life-changing situations, life-changing elements, life-changing, it just happens. When you've got nowhere else to turn to and you turn to God, and suddenly God responds, and God's at work in your life and in your heart, it can be a life-altering experience. In this case, not so much, as we will continue on this story, and we'll find Pharaoh doesn't exactly fall into that category. Prayer, though, that's what we find. We find in this particular situation, Pharaoh turned to prayer. And prayer is sometimes part of God's plan in a unique situation. You see, this is finally the point where Pharaoh acknowledges the Almighty. This is the final point where Pharaoh finally says, okay, God can do something. Now, it only took the second plague for him to figure it out, and there's going to be 10 more, or 10 plagues total. So obviously it didn't go too far into Pharaoh's head, but he began to understand that God is sovereign, and God can do something about his situation. This unique situation, prayer is sometimes the point that God uses, quite frankly, to reveal that his sovereignty and his power. You see, Moses prays to God and asks God to remove the frogs. And what we have is the frogs being removed. God answers the prayer. Miracles do happen through prayer. And that's the one thing we can take out of this is God sometimes demonstrates his power and his sovereignty through answered prayer. It's that simple. God sometimes will demonstrate his power and his sovereignty through answered prayer. Miracles happen as a result of prayer. We've all heard them. Bad things happen to people, and suddenly at the last moment they're praying, and then boom, the problem's resolved. The situation's changed. Prayers sometimes can be God's way of demonstrating his sovereignty, is through answered prayer. It's a fundamental way God sometimes works. Unique situation or not, sometimes it is simple answer to prayer that makes all the difference. However, as we talk about that, we also need to understand that just because you pray doesn't necessarily make you changed or even a believer in God. You can start to believe in him, you can start to pray to him, you can do all of that, but it doesn't necessarily make things change. As we read, there's a couple of things that actually do happen. The first thing is that we find that in verse 7, the magicians did the same thing by their occult practices. You see, Pharaoh once again turns to them, and he says, hey, can you bring up frogs? And it's like, yeah, we can. So clearly his heart isn't sold totally on the Lord. The second thing that we find is, he then puts tests before God. Now, what do you mean? And I say, well, take a look at that in verse 9 and 10 when he says, ask God to remove him. Moses said, all right, I'll do it, but when do you want me to? And he says, tomorrow. Keep in mind, there are billions of frogs covering the land, all the land. Everybody's being plagued by these things. And Pharaoh wants them gone tomorrow. Exterminators will tell you it takes a long time to get rid of just a handful of rodents. Can you imagine billions of frogs? Wow. Yeah, that's a task. And Pharaoh's putting a test before the Almighty. We see that already. Just because you're praying doesn't mean that your attitude's right before the God. Just saying that. What we have here, though, is Moses' response, which is very interesting. He goes, as you have said, so that you may know there is no one like Yahweh our God, the frogs will go away from you, your people, and your officials tomorrow. That's interesting, isn't it? The only reason why God's doing this, that Pharaoh will know that Yahweh is God. The answer to the prayer demonstrates God's sovereignty over the land of Egypt. The answer to prayer demonstrates God's sovereignty over the land of Egypt. And that's what we can see out of this. Prayer is part of God's way of dealing with unique situations. We'll also see through this that in these unique situations, the judgments of God are sometimes demonstrating his sovereignty as well. Oftentimes I've got a misconception that I think many people have, right? They've done something wrong or bad or whatever, and they turn to God and they say, please forgive me. And they just expect the slate to be wiped clean and everything to be okay. No problems. Doesn't work that way. It does not work that way. As we read here that the plague of frogs has already happened. Pharaoh's asking God to remove him. He's come to that point where he's acknowledging God and he's praying to God. And he says, fix this situation, God. God says, okay, but you're still plagued. There are piles and piles of frogs. And he says, the Lord did as Moses said, and the frogs in the houses, and the courtyards, and the fields died. They piled them up in countless heaps. In other words, you couldn't count them. And heaps could be big old piles, think 4, 5, 6, 7 feet tall. That's a lot of frogs. Dead frogs. And there's a terrible odor in the land. You see, just because you turn to God, it doesn't necessarily mean that the consequences of your actions are going to go away. Now, for example, you rob a bank, hop in your getaway car, get across town, get convicted by this, you stop, you pull over, you pray to God, ask him to forgive you. Don't expect everything to go away, like all the problems disappear. You don't get a get out of jail free card just because you prayed. Just because God's forgiven you doesn't mean that the consequences of your actions won't happen. We think of, we have this idea that we've prayed and we made things right with people, that there shouldn't be any consequences. People forgive us or forgive me, then I shouldn't be held accountable for what I've done. No, it doesn't work that way. Life is not about that. God really set out here to show Pharaoh that there are consequences for his actions. He could have avoided this if he'd let the people of Israel go, but he didn't. So now he's got the frogs. Now he comes to God and says, please deal with this situation. God says, okay, I will. But you're still plagued by the frogs. Now they're just dead. And they stink. And they're everywhere. You know what's interesting about Pharaoh? In this situation and through this judgment that he sees, he doesn't change his heart. He acknowledges God. He sees God answer the prayer. He sees relief a little bit. Pharaoh hardens his heart. As a result of that, plagues are going to get worse. The plagues were going to get worse. This unique situation, this unique episode in Egyptian history, where frogs covered the entirety of the land, It's a very fascinating one. It demonstrates that God's ability to have power and sovereignty in unique ways, in unique situations, through humble means, through a frog. It demonstrates the unique sovereignty and power through answered prayer. And it demonstrates his power and sovereignty in unique ways through his judgment. In this unique situation, God's power and sovereignty is on display. We look at some things and realize that sometimes God uses the most unique situations to accomplish his will. He does. You know, there's just a fundamental reality of God. You know, unique situations, unique things, God is just a unique God. You know, we look at all the examples we can find in the Bible of Jesus curing people, for example. And each time it seems like it's a little different. He spits and makes mud. He washes somebody. He just tells someone to get up and walk. He's unique. And in unique situations that we find ourselves in, sometimes it's good for us to remember God's power and his sovereignty is overall, including our unique situation. We may not have frogs plaguing us, but we all have something in our life that is unique, something that is challenging, something that is hard to explain or comprehend. God is a God that is sovereign of that situation. God is a God that is sovereign of that situation. God's power, his sovereignty is evident all around us. We don't need frogs to demonstrate that. So the next time that we are in a unique situation, the next time that we are struggling with something, let us remember, God uses humble means to demonstrate his power. He uses prayer and answered prayer to demonstrate his power. He uses his judgment in those unique situations to demonstrate his power. In essence, as we summarize that, our unique situation may simply be another godly demonstration.